Namaskar. My name is Mike Fontana, and I was born and grew up in New York City, USA. Fortunately, I grew into my formidable teenage years in the mid and late 1960s when a very great cultural, musical, and artistic renaissance was happening, often referred to as the hippie revolution. But actually, it was a lot more than that. It was just as much a philosophical and spiritual renaissance where a lot of ancient Eastern philosophical teachings and writings were starting to all of a sudden surface. The thing that most caught my attention were the teachings on Hindu yoga and meditation that were beginning to become prevalent during those times. And there was a lot of yogis and authors who had gone to India and came back and started writing about all of this amazing stuff that we had never ever heard about or dreamt of. You know, we were born into a very materialistic society. And all of a sudden, a whole new world opened up for us. Particularly me, I all of a sudden became very interested in Hindu philosophy and Hindu yoga, and all of it just totally changed the course and nature of my whole life. And I was very grateful to all these yogis that started to come over to teach us practically these amazing spiritual systems. I also learned shortly after that the very first yogi that came over from India to teach yoga to the West, that happened almost 100 years before this, was Swami Vivekananda. That was totally mind-blowing for me that so many years back this actually started. Later on, I realized that what Swamiji had done and all at that time was to lay the groundwork for what was about to happen. Of course, I guess from the get-go, Swamiji was influencing me. A few years later, came to India, and I was introduced there to Paramahamsa Ramakrishna through books and writings and people talking about him. And I came to know that Ramakrishna was Vivekananda's guru. And all of a sudden, these connections started coming to me. I came back from India and found myself studying all of this stuff and practicing the little that I had learned. And I came across some of Swamiji's works. Now, up till then, one can imagine that, especially for a foreigner and a beginner in all of this, that a lot of these concepts, particularly about Vedanta, which I was starting to study, were a little bit difficult for a Westerner to really grasp the inner meanings of these, especially since it had to be translated in English. But when I started reading Swamiji's works, I found that he was able to convey such high transcendental ideas and teachings in such a simple, direct language. And his, the way he did this was so direct. One in particular that really helped me because I was having a little bit of trouble understanding the gist of Vedanta, which for some reason I was really pursuing. And it was his bold proclamation that you are the Atman, that I was the Atman. And like somehow it just penetrated me. And I realized that this indeed was the goal of the Indian philosophy, in particular Vedanta. And when I came to read more of what he had done and realized that he had made this main teaching that we were really God, that our fellow beings were really the Atman, that he made this the cornerstone of the Ramakrishna mission, and that he propagated the idea, which he learned from his guru, that the goal of, and made the goal of the whole Ramakrishna mission to serve our fellow men, not as humans, but serving the God within them. Not only serving, worshiping as you served. And this was all very inspiring to me. And actually, that very concept kept growing in my mind as years went by and really helped me to understand things. Now, as much as, I came to believe and could really understand what it meant that we were the Atman, still, as years went by, there was a doubt that, okay, that's true, but can a human being actually come to feel and know for certain that he was the Atman? And, well, I just assumed, well, maybe it'll happen one day, but, I didn't really know. And then one time I was reading about Ramakrishna's final years in his battle with his throat cancer, and how all of his, close disciples were caring for him in Kosipur Garden. And one time, at this point, Swami Vivekananda was the leader of these of Ramakrishna's young disciples and put in charge of their learning. So I was reading that one time as Ramakrishna lay pretty close to death on his on a bed, and all of these young disciples of his were caring for him. And Swamiji was there, and he noticed that there was this, what you might call it again, some vessel was next to Ramakrishna, in which Ramakrishna was spitting when he could, all the phlegm, all the mucus, all of the pads, the cotton pads that were used to somehow gauze, try to bring some relief to him, that was filled with all this, stuff from his cancer, from his throat, was in a vessel right next to him. And Swamiji was noticing how some of his brother disciples were kind of like avoiding that, and kind of like, avoiding all of the rather disgusting things that were natural to come from such a sick person. So Swamiji walked up to that vessel, lifted it, and drank it, everything in it, and walked away as if he had just had a nice, refreshing, cold glass of water. And I don't know, something happened to me when I read that, and he just went right back and sat down and started observing. And of course, everybody there was flabbergasted at what just happened. But for me, at that moment, I realized beyond any doubt that Swamiji knew for sure that he was the Atman. There's no other way that that could have been done. Anyway, I continued reading a lot of his works. And the thing about Swamiji's teachings that are most inspiring is that from time to time, when you needed them most, some of the things that he said would come to you and teach you certain things. Now, one thing in particular that had helped me much later on in my spiritual life was his phrase. He once said that when you find the only way to really tell if you're making spiritual progress or if you're having difficulties progressing, you must open up the hood, your own hood, and look inside and see what you find. Now, of course, this meaning on the surface was quite clear as to what it meant. You have to look inside you and see what is happening, what is not happening. But I never really delved too much into it, as I never really felt I had too much of a difficulties that I had to look into. But much later on in my spiritual life, believe it or not, much later on, I began to feel that my progress was being inhibited, that there was something that was holding me back. And this, I could say, really was only about 6 or 7 years ago. And all of a sudden, Swamiji's saying came to me, open up the hood of your car, open up your hood. And I opened up my hood in my mind, and I began to ponder and look and see what was there. And to my utter disbelief and bewilderment, I saw so many, let's say, bad things. I just saw so much in me, so much anger that I had I never knew about. So many things that I resented, that I hated. And I'm talking about so many desires, subtle desires. And the more I would ponder them, the more I realized that these were the things that were actually holding me back spiritually. It's as if, you make progress at first, you meditate, and you have really good sessions, you have satsang, you get inspired. And then when it really comes down to the nitty gritty of your spiritual development, there's certain things that come back and you have to take care of. And a lot of writings came my way, a lot of teachings about how to deal with all of this, and that this was part of the purification process. And well, to make a long story short, I actually started taking care of these matters, going into them, seeing what was there, overcoming them, using different techniques. And I realized that to purify your mind and your heart is just as important to your spiritual development as being able to sit and meditate. This was a very great teaching that I attribute directly to Swamiji. But above and beyond all teachings, at some point in your spiritual career, you might say, you want to be shown something concrete, something real about what you're reading about, what you're pondering about, what you're trying to make your meditation about. And it's a very rare teacher that can actually show you something concretely that you can experience, that you could touch, so to speak. And herein lies the beauty of Swamiji and his power to do so. I will relate to you one such personal incident that happened to me in regard to this. The very first time I went to Bailor Mutt, about 2002, 2003, and of course I had a letter from my teacher and the person who initiated me, Swami Adishwarananda, in New York. So I was able to stay at the foreigners' guest house in Bailor Mutt, where the food was somewhat a little bit better than what the Indians who were staying there were, but it was still very much part of Bailor Mutt. One thing I noticed when I first entered Bailor Mutt is that there was this tremendous, I don't know, like a blanket of spiritual feelings, of joy, of like a subtle bliss that covered the whole atmosphere. And I realized that this was Ramakrishna's grace, and a lot of people came there, and a lot of people were meditating, a lot of people were doing the arti, so it is bound to feel something like that. And of course, one of the main attractions of Bailor Mutt was Swamiji's room, which was left more or less intact, just as it's the place where Swamiji stayed when he came to Bailor Mutt from his many wanderings. It's also the place where he willingly went into his Mahasamadhi. So of course this drew my curiosity. I went up to the room and looked inside and saw the place, the bed where he was lying when he went into his final samadhi. But it was locked. We couldn't go in, and this somewhat disturbed me. I really wanted to be in that room. And all of a sudden but the window was open, like I said, and you could there were bars or something there. And something overcame me and told me to put my hand inside. So I took my hand and I put it into the actual room through the bars, and suddenly this like tingling waves of bliss began to come in through my fingertips, up my arm, into my mind. And it's like I took my hand out in disbelief, but still I felt something. I thought it must be me. So again, I put my hand in, and again, the same tingling sensation of bliss entered my fingers into my whole body. And I was just filled with joy and love. So of course I went down, and 2 days later it occurred to me, Swamiji always said, as his guru Ramakrishna said, you can't just accept things, you have to test them. And even though in a way I didn't want anything to come and ruin the wonderful experience I had, but still I said, let me see if this happens again. So I went back into the room, back up the stairs to Swamiji's room, and again I put my hand into the window, and again, even more powerful, this bliss overcame me. Again, I took my hand out, again put it in, and it was the same thing. And it was just like, wow, it's as if he was showing me something that I needed to experience, that this was real. I can't put in words what it was that was real, but what came to me was that, I always thought that, always wondered about, these people, like I read that Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, before they died, in the days before they died, they took an almanac, almost as if to see when was the most auspicious day to leave their bodies. I often wondered about it. I said, what is, why? Well, I realized I couldn't understand such a deep concept as to what would be a most auspicious day for them to leave their bodies. But then it occurred to me that they weren't looking for an auspicious day for themselves to leave the body, but they were looking for an auspicious time to leave their body for us. Because this is something amazing that Swamiji left behind, not only in his room, through all of Bailor Mutt. And I tell you, though I can't put it in words, this is one of the most inspiring experiences of my life. Thank you very much for listening.